So we're gonna have some discussion now and tap into some of Arwen's great, amazing experience and things that she can talk to us about. So the first sort of area we're going to talk about is story ideation. That is sometimes things organizations struggle with is where do you start, right? That's the beginning. And sometimes getting started with storytelling can be hard. So just right off the bat, Aaron, what do you think makes a great story?
Personally, I'm drawn to characters, and I think I'm less concerned with stories that are high production value and more interested in watching really compelling characters and subjects. I also often find that when there's truth, but there's a little bit of imagination thrown in, that can be also really, really compelling and draw you in. Like I think about sometimes when there's a story that's really hard to visualize, but people use animation or they find other ways to sort of communicate the emotions and the intensity of something. I think that can be really memorable. And so, yeah, truth with animation. I don't know if that's too abstract, but that's kind of what I keep coming back to.
Yeah, sometimes it's just a necessity, right? I mean, sometimes your organization may fill this need. There's some sort of need that isn't being filled by whether it's government or whatever or private sector, and yeah, and explaining that need maybe is a little harder. It seems to be, yeah, with like food, housing, education, everyone understands those things. But if you have a different niche, it can be harder. I love what you said about characters too, right? Everyone remembers for like if you have a favorite movie or favorite show, I bet it's the character, right? You remember a certain character is kind of your favorite. So, um,
Definitely.
how do you approach kind of the initial uh approach kind of building upon your initial story idea? Once you've got a good idea, how do you start building that?
Yeah, I really feel like collaboration is key. And I think what's tricky and that might be relevant for folks on the call here is that, sometimes you are working alone and you are trying to wear many hats. And I want to acknowledge that, especially in the nonprofit sector, that can be a very real challenge. But collaboration will ultimately, I think, make or break a lot of storytelling in terms of making sure you have enough eyes, enough voices, and enough people just helping you mold that clay right at the beginning and thinking about what you need. Sometimes it's very clear, but again, like we all have blind spots, and I have a little more I want to say about that later on. But um, I think that's always going to be the first piece for me is collaboration and who you bring onto your team and who you work with. Um, and then really thinking about once you have that idea, who's maybe already doing that work or who are those experts that you can partner with? Because ultimately, maybe there's already work being done that you can amplify, making sure that whatever it is that you are bringing to the table is additive, of course, and not, redundant. And again, that's an opportunity to collaborate with people who are experts in that area. And of course, often the nonprofits themselves have their in-house people, but sometimes it's it can be so rewarding to also partner with another organization, partner with people out there who are researching, so I think that's what I come back to is like, it's all about people. We're talking about people, we're telling stories, but like we also need each other in that process of actually doing the work itself too.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. Sometimes partnerships are necessary. Sometimes too, like we're working with an organization and just the cost of us doing something, we're like, it's not worth it. Tap into some other resources you have, and maybe it's the people who are benefiting from your work, maybe have them do little cell phone videos and send them in or whatever. But it is, I think, more important to get to that core of that story than it is necessarily like production value or making it perfect.
Yeah.
We did have some clarification, it looked like, too, about asset framing. So I see what they're saying now. They're saying, when you approach a story, say you're telling an individual person's story, you could start by what are the challenges they had, what did they go through, how are they now, or It could go in a different order. How are they now? And then sort of flashback, and so it's the same content in a different structure. It's a little bit different order. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, my thought kind of just off the bat is it really depends upon what the goal. Sometimes a certain order is better for certain goals, and a different order of telling that story is different for other goals. Do you have any kind of ideas around that?
I would agree. I think you can also experiment. And I think that's a really helpful thing, trying out, if you have the room to do that, different things, and then looking at those metrics and saying, are more people watching this when we lead with certain things at the top of a story? I know, people are quick to click away, right? And so if you want people to watch a full 1 minute, what is it that's going to grab people's attention? Sometimes, it can be something very visual as opposed to something where it's just a talking head. So I think we're going to talk a little bit more about this too. One of the things that we're going to get to more is around kind of the ethics and thinking about growth over kind of trauma and stuff. So I think that's something to kind of keep in mind too. And hopefully we can kind of answer some of this, Chris, over the course of the rest of the discussion. But you've stumped me a little bit. I'm like, well.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. And that's, I find, yeah, after like I've gone and captured all the content, right? And I'm working with an organization collaboratively on building the story. That is like the thing that actually really comes up is what order do we put things in? So it's a tricky one, and that's a good question. So
Yeah.
kind of about driving action and sort of the strategy behind storytelling. What do you think kind of makes stories for you persuasive or like mind changing?
Yeah, I do think that when there's an opportunity to learn something and to have a tangible takeaway and an action item, that sometimes that feels like if I'm trying to be persuaded of something, I also want to know how I can often get involved, as opposed to just sort of being presented with, depressing facts and then and then being like, oh, about your day. It's always, I think we're seeing a lot of people, even in really short form content, figuring out how to do that effectively. And so I wanted to kind of make one point about what we were talking about earlier, which is that I think taking your time, if you can, again, the luxury of having time to slow down and look at everything will also help when you are building up those stories. And then it gives you a chance to think, hey, in what order do we need to do this? And how will we persuade someone? And how, what will that impact be? Because it's not just, who your typical audience is. It can be that kind of outer spiral, the larger community, in theory, could be also the ones that are digesting your video. And so what will their takeaway be? And what perception of your organization and your work will they get from that? So I'm trying to think about,
Yeah,
mind
no,
changing is challenging,
it
but
is.
people don't
Those are
want to
great
change.
points. I love the thing about surprising. You said about something surprising. So, and people, I think, underestimate how small people's attention span is, especially online. Like you literally have about 10 seconds to grab someone's attention. Like if there's nothing happening in the first 10 seconds of your piece that's going to grab people, you need to like think about that. Years and years ago, there was actually a TED talk from the vice president of community engagement from YouTube.
Okay.
And he did a whole study on what makes a video viral. And it was very interesting. He listed, it was something like 6 things, I think. The top of the list was something surprising, something that's like, whoa, look at that. I've never seen that before. So that was something that they found hugely impactful for getting people to watch something, but also share it. It was a big thing with sharing.
Right.
So let's talk about some like story traits, maybe. Like,
Mhm.
what do you think? What are traits you think or that you see that keep coming up in like really impactful stories? And I think you identified like surprise, right, as one. Are there any other traits you can think of?
I think what goes along with that is also then, if you're presenting information that might be surprising, there's also honesty and a willingness to be vulnerable with that. And what questions are we not asking? I mean, I think it ends up being this idea of how can you um, bring people, how can you bring their attention span in and focus on what you're trying to tell them, but also actually, ask some questions that maybe they haven't even thought to ask themselves, or that they're not realizing need to be asked. And so I think when you get a really impactful story, oftentimes it's because there's also this pursuit of the truth in a way that just floors you.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
just,
great. I mean, I
I think
love
about the
that.
long lost podcast. I'm like,
Yeah.
here they are, many years later, trying to uncover something, and it's really impactful, and you're not going to stop thinking about it because it's like people love
Yeah.
investigative, right?
Yeah, it's
So.
yeah, it's the mystery and then the surprise. You don't know something, you find out little bits. So kind of continuing on this theme, like of strategy, you have a story and you have all these different details. So how do you approach like which details to focus in on? Because like, of course, we talked about attention span, this and that. You don't have 2 hours to sit someone down, and they're not going to necessarily sit down that long. So how do you decide what details in a specific story to kind of hone in on?
I do think it's this balance of the facts and the stats and all of that with the human story, and figuring out what that balance is for your storytelling. Because um, right, you have limited time, but you also need to be able to draw people in, and people will be drawn to the human side of it. So I think, for fast forward, the example that I brought up earlier with aging, they just identified, hey, we have this problem, which is we need people to take action and prepare for aging. And what they did in the film was that then they had 4 human stories. They had 4 pairs of millennials with their parents, one child, one adult, or one child, one boomer. And we got to see their process. We got to see what it was like for them to go through the painful process of trying to prepare for aging. But it was so clear. It was like, what is the problem? And then, how can we show people that are navigating this particular issue? And then you can draw your own conclusions, and you can take away from that, hey, I want to, take some action for myself, or, maybe there's a delay, and you're not always going to have people that are willing to do something right away. Sometimes you need to sit with it, and sometimes you need another reminder that this is a thing that affects people, right? So people will tune in different ways, right? Some people are going to take action immediately. Some people are going to start following you on social media, and then 6 months later decide they want to volunteer, so sort of preparing yourself for that, I think, is part of thinking about what you can focus on. It's like, it's the short-term and the long-term impact of that story.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to talk a bit now sort of about the ethics of storytelling. And this is very important for a lot of organizations that we work with. A lot of nonprofits, you have your own story of your organization itself, but a lot of times you are using and leveraging someone else's personal story for whatever means, bringing attention to the need that the community has around that subject or whatever. So, what are some of the most important things you think that you have to keep in mind when you're telling someone else's story?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things is, of course, not making assumptions, and that is challenging. But starting from a place of trust will happen more easily if you're also not making assumptions and assuming someone's pronouns, assuming how they would talk about themselves based on the way that they present themselves in society, right? So giving your subjects, your characters, a chance to advocate and explain that for themselves, sort of before there's even a more formal recording of that, I think can be really helpful too, in thinking about how you're telling someone else's story, but they need to really be actively involved in telling their own story and who they are, and letting them bring their full selves, to the table in that. I mean, it goes without saying, but I think tokenization can happen very often, you know, when we're not asking ourselves some of these questions of like, how do we let people bring them their full selves, and, you know, not make those assumptions about what people want to focus on. And so you might have something that you want someone to talk about, you know, in an interview, this experience they had, you know, and they might surprise you and want to talk about some other stuff. And so leaving a little bit of room for that and having that trust there, I think, is when you're going to have those little magical moments of, oh my gosh, well, now we now we have even more to build on, you know, and we have this really full story and character that we can share with the world, because it's, you know, we're all humans, and we want to be seen, and we want to be heard, and we don't want to be minimized. We don't want our stories to be reduced to some stereotypes. So I think another thing to kind of consider with that in terms of story too is just the fact that like language is always changing and shifting too. So you have to kind of do your own work to kind of stay up to speed with how best practices are changing. So
Those are great points. I love that. Yeah, I tend to sometimes identify a potential issue maybe when I will be maybe working with an organization. They come up with maybe some interview questions and they're ultra specific, and I'm like, you need to allow that room, right, for the person to uh you know, tell it themselves in their own language and go down their own path through telling the story. You can't necessarily maybe ask such specific
yeah,
things, you know.
yeah, you
You
can't
may miss
script.
out on something really good.
Yeah, exactly. You can't script people's.
Yeah, yep. I have a saying I always say, I say scripts are for actors.
Yeah, and
You
it's
know,
true.
like usually in my story building um process, unless I'm working with a professional actor, I don't write anything. You know, there isn't a script at all. So this is a great discussion. So now I want to ask you, you know, what do you think are some signs that you may be starting to cross an ethical line? You're building your story and you're doing whatever, you know, what are some things that you think people should really look out for?
Well, so I know that we have a slide too about the ethicalstorytelling.com. And I think this is a really helpful resource that helps you answer some of those concerns when you are approaching storytelling. There's a lot of free tools on here. I highly recommend it. And this was introduced to me from Sandra Boone through she's a nonprofit communication specialist. And I've met her through the YMPN Twin Cities, the Young Nonprofit Professionals Network. But she's a huge advocate of this. And I think it's just a tool that should be widely shared. So it's like, here we are just, you know, trying to get the word out, because some of the tools will help that they have on there. You know, when they have guidance on use of victims' images, there's a whole report that helps you understand if you're using someone's images, you know, what is the really ethical way to go about doing that. And that involves, you know, thinking about where that ethical line is, and do you need to be following up with people a couple years later, you know, to kind of get second consent. And so some of those concepts are explored really well on there. But I think when you're thinking about crossing an ethical line, for me, it's often a gut instinct, and it's often that something's not sitting well with me. And sometimes it's challenging to bring that up when you're not in that position of power, but it is necessary to at least ask questions and say, hey, can we take a step back, and can we think about what we're putting out into the world? Because you do make mistakes sometimes, but it is your obligation then to fix that and hopefully, you know, try to mend that and try to put something else out that, you know, more ethical sounds sort of high and mighty, but, you know, is tells the truth in a way that everyone is in agreement around. And I think we talked about this earlier, but just more eyes, more eyeballs on the work that you're doing before it goes out the door will help mitigate any sort of issues, right? You don't want to be the only one that created, edited, and then posted. You know, you want to make sure there's, again, you've got your team, you've got your collaborative team in place. So
Those are great tips. And yeah, and this resource is awesome. I've sometimes found sometimes there can be like an issue in the editing process. You know, you're doing this editing and it's like, I do sometimes see editors are a little, it's not even an obvious thing. They may not even know they're doing it, but they kind of, through the editing, you can kind of almost frame things up with your own biases and your own kind of like way you view the world, right? And so for sure, like I do a lot of editing, so I'm really conscious about that, like, not overlaying some type of my own personal view through editing on a particular story. So there's we can open this up to Q&A about anything now, really. We've kind of gone through a lot of the material we wanted to cover. We have a little bit of time left, maybe 6-ish minutes. So feel free in the Q&A panel, if anyone has any questions for Arwen or myself, we can hang on for a little bit longer. We also do have one more thing maybe you want to talk about quick, is this
Yeah.
YNPN group.
Yeah, so I mentioned that just now, but I am one of the communications co-chairs for the YMPN Twin Cities, and it's a young nonprofit professionals network chapter of a national organization. And so I would encourage you to join, but also I think it's just worth mentioning because there are a lot of blog posts by people like Sandra Boone, other young leaders really in the community that are thinking about how to address a lot of different issues that relate to the sector. So it's really focused on the nonprofit sector at large, but then I think you can kind of find those niches within it. And so I appreciate the chance to kind of plug that. And I'm glad that some of the links will be included in a follow-up email. So some of these resources and examples will be available to everyone.
Yeah, so everyone, you will get a follow-up email. It's going to come I think it comes Monday or Tuesday early next week. It will have links to all of this, all of these examples too, and some other tools and resources for you. And of course, this entire thing will be available on demand, and the link will be in there too. So if you missed any part of this, you're going to be able to go watch it as many times as you want. You don't have to register again or anything. It'll just be available for free. So, so if there's any questions, you can pop them in there. This is a big topic, obviously. And I was wondering too, this is kind of just Minnesota right now, in Minneapolis, we're kind of in the spotlight, right? Because of what's happening here. Have you found, are people thinking about that, about their story? It's almost like there's stories happening everywhere in every part of the country.
Mm-hmm.
But, the focus of the national media moves around as different things happen. And obviously there's a lot of focus on, on Minnesota right now. Have you seen that affect, the storytellers you work with and how people are approaching things?
I think so. And I think, Chris, the what you shared, I think there's a lot of crossover with the link that you shared and the ethical storytelling framework in terms of how do you actually think about defining communities, as they say, by their aspirations as opposed to their challenges, and really kind of centering people's humanity in that. And so I hope that in this moment, people are recognizing that the way we do report and we tell stories does really matter, because there are really harmful results when people aren't allowed to be fully present in telling their own stories, and everything is told through a lens that can be traced to white supremacy. It's like we do need to be thinking about that, and there is duty and obligation in there to think about your own biases. So hopefully, at the very least, people are thinking about that, and just trying to keep doing the work. It's like, once you know better, do better, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got an interesting question in here. We've got a couple questions have come up. So someone is asking, they would love to know your favorite, most memorable, most fun to work on storytelling opportunity throughout your career. Do you have a particular favorite or something you really, really stood out to you?
Oh gosh. I will say the first project that I worked on with Twin Cities PBS was focused on science and evolution, and I did not realize how much I loved working on that. Like, there is something so fun about seeing high-res graphics of animals that I would never get to see with my own eyes, and that existed 3 million years ago. So to some degree, even though I actually prefer being out in the field and really getting to make the media, sometimes the subject itself ends up being the thing that makes it the most enjoyable. And the team was just like stacked. I mean, there's these scientists who were like, nope, this is exactly what we need. This is how we do it. So that was a huge privilege, actually.
That's super cool. So the fire hire stuff was really cool that I worked on. I talked about that a little. There was one really memorable story. One of the people who was in those 4 PSA kind of little videos we did. So when she was a child, she was something like 10. Her entire house burned down
Oh my
and
God.
they lost literally everything they owned. Cars, house, everything. They had nothing. Just standing out there in her pajamas in the middle of the night. And she said that the firemen that came, she said they were so comforting to her. And she really appreciated what they did for their family. They couldn't bring anything back or restore their property, but she thought they were incredibly comforting. And that stuck in her mind her whole life. And she was like, I want to do that too. I want to give back, and believe it's still the same community too, that where her house was when she was young. That's where she's serving now as a volunteer firefighter. So I thought that was super cool. I was just like, that is an amazing story. We don't have much time, but we do have a question here, and this is something that is kind of a hot topic. Someone put in a question about cancel culture. How is cancel culture sort of affecting storytelling? That's kind of a loaded term that might mean a lot of different things to different people. But have you seen, as this term emerges, right? People are using it now. Have you seen that affect storytelling at all?
I think there's a difference between storytelling and just free speech to some degree, and I think that is a very loaded term. And the origins of cancel culture come from like queer, BIPOC communities, and so it is a tricky thing to be able to apply. I think again, like we're all being faced, especially those of us that are white, like myself and Nicholas, with, what are our biases and how is that affecting our storytelling? And so again, it's just making sure that we are really actually asking some hard questions of ourselves in terms of the story we want to tell versus the story we should be telling. And so I don't know if that's answering that so much, but I'd like to think there's plenty of room for imagination
Yeah.
and creativity, and um, really highlighting the ways that people are adapting and growing and resilient. And so I want to come out of that in like a hopeful way. So
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that is, I don't know really how applicable that term really is to true genuine storytelling. I think it's kind of a loaded term, and yeah, I don't know if it's the meaning behind it is really very genuine. I think it's kind of like you talked a little bit about how you need to check back in maybe and how things change.
mhm.
I think that's like I've seen that now even on some TV shows that are just older. They have a warning about how it's not,
Yeah,
culturally sensitive.
right.
It's a good example. I think it's a good example how, things change, like language changes, people's expectations of how stories are told and different things change. So
Yeah.
it's something to think about. So we're at our time now. I just want to thank Arwen so much for being our guest. This was fantastic. I just love all the insight and experience you can bring to this topic. So everyone, thank you for joining us. Like I said, you'll be able to rewatch it. You'll get a follow-up email, and there's many more awesome guests and more free information, free webinars coming up. So keep an eye on the website. Thank you so much, Arwen, for
Thanks
your
for having
time,
me.
and I have a good one.